evening and happy Jamhuri Day to you from wherever it is you are watching us from. Welcome to this edition of Planet Action, where today we are taking stock of the Africa Climate Summit and the COP28 that has just come to an end today. And we look at how these two documents married each other, and if at all the African position from the Nairobi Declaration was actually adopted at COP28. My name is Dennis Aseto, and in studio with me I'll be having a panelist of four individuals as we have this discussion. But the Africa Climate Summit that culminated to the Nairobi Declaration created an avenue for Africa to have a unified voice on matters climate change and give their position and demands on what will work best in the fight against climate change. As the world converged in Dubai for COP28, Africa armed themselves with the Nairobi Declaration, but that as it may, did it have any impact? What are some of the wins and losses at COP28? In studio with me is Dr. Felix Odhiambo, advocate of the High Court, Ruth Ngeshu, Global Advocacy Director, Pathfinder International, Shadrach Agaki, Climate Change and Food System Communication Consultant, and Dr. Andrew Ambua from Africa Voices Dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on set as we have this discussion, and I will start directly from you, Wakili. Now, as we have this discussion on climate change, there is always the aspect of the law. Even the Nairobi Declaration, it's all about policy in place. When it comes to us talking about climate change, do we have policies that guide us on how to fight this, even from the context of the Africa Climate Summit and Nairobi Declaration?
Thank you so much, Dennis, for having me here. Yes, we always have policies and laws in place. When you're dealing with climate change, because it's a global issue with impacts on the environment, the starting point for the conversation on the law is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's the global instrument that really deals with climate change issues globally. And then, because this is just a framework convention, you then have a number of other laws that feed into it. For example, you have the Kyoto Protocol that operationalized the UNFCCC. And then later on, you have others like the Paris Agreement. And then you then also have other international conventions that may not have been adopted through the framework of the UNFCCC, but they feed into this. For example, you have the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Then they are then cascaded downwards into the local level, where, for example, in Kenya now you have the Climate Change Act of 2016, and then you also have other sectoral laws that have a bearing on climate change. So yes, issues of law and policy are very much in place. What we may go into a discussion around is how they actually, whether they have actually been effective or not.
Now, Ruth, when we talk about climate change, there's always the aspect of health involved. You are big on matters to do with health. And even at Africa Climate Summit, health was actually given a focus on that, because when you talk about, right now, the country is dealing with floods, waterborne diseases. We talk about extreme sunlight. There is sun rays, the hen's skin. Now, from where you come from, health and climate change, has it been given the focus and the attention it needs?
Thank you, Dennis. What I would say is that, yes, health, we have seen a lot of progress in matters, health being recognized in the climate change space, and we have come from far. When you look at what happened at COP27, actually we were speaking to ourselves. We only had some discussions at the WHO pavilion. There was nothing more. It is the health sector, people speaking to themselves. But there has been a lot of advocacy that has happened, and coming to the Africa Climate Summit, we had several events and several conversations, even the build-up of the Africa Climate Summit. We had key players meeting in Malawi, and we had a position on health and climate. But it is unfortunate that in the Nairobi Declaration, unfortunately, we had only one mention of health in the whole document. But that did not really affect the discussions at COP. When you look at what has just happened, we actually have a health declaration out of COP that has been approved by about 148 of 198 parties, and that is very good progress when it comes to recognition of health in climate, in the climate debate. At the country level, I'm also very happy that right now we have what we are calling the climate and health strategy that just got launched with, at the COP28, and we hope that this will help streamline health in all sectors, because we have been having siloed discussion when it comes to climate, and it has just been environment and some other discussions here and there, but not really health streamlined. We hope with this discussion and having this document in place, we will have now health well mainstreamed, even when we're talking matters finance. So we hope that will be well featured within.
And I come to you, Shadrach. Now, you are a climate change researcher, communicator, and you equally share your views with the National Assembly. Now, from a policy perspective, from the National Assembly, who sit down and craft laws that hence goes to help us deal with these issues of climate change. We know President William Ruto is big on matters climate change. He talks about how we need to deal with financing, how it is important for us to plant around 15 billion trees by 2032. From your sphere, how are we handling issues to do with climate change? You talk with parliamentarians every other day. What do they say?
I think climate change is a new baby in the ground now, and yeah, I can say we are having progress, meaningful progress, but it needs to be enhanced. It's like you said, interact with the policy making processes, and number one, we need to appreciate that Kenya is really making headways. We have the Climate Change Act. We had it amended in this year, and we are having the conversation. The fact that the president is leading the conversation, for me as a communication person, is important, because what we need to do, even as we come together to discuss, is what Simon Steele was telling the COP, the people who are attending the COP, that it is our obligation to do more out of the COPs. From the Nairobi Declaration, you know, that's when the Climate Change Act Amendment Bill 2023 was, was launched. So that is meaningful progress, but we need to do more in terms of policy, in terms of linking the interconnections between different aspects of. I remember one time I had a conversation with Honorable Dr. Nyikao, and I was asking him, we are talking about climate change. Do you see how climate change impacts health? And you know what he told me really, influenced my thinking. He asked me, look at the floods. The floods we've been told now are leading to cholera outbreak. That's the impact of climate change, because climate change is weather variability, and that weather variability are changing different aspects of economic, social, and psychosocial development. So the interconnections between different aspects of livelihood need to be made clearly to climate change, because then the adaptation measures that we are going to take will emerge from that conversation that we are having. I can also tell you, given my interaction with the policy making process for the last 10 years, that public opinion shapes the policies that are made.
Let me come to you, Dr. Now, you come from a perspective that African voices need to be heard when we talk about issues to do with climate change. And even now, as we were heading to COP28, there was the Nairobi Declaration that pretty much is the voice of Africa as we go to COP28. Has that document been given a seat at the table?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you to my colleagues for those great insights. One, we have to appreciate that we started from somewhere. When we met in Nairobi for Africa Climate Summit, we spoke in one voice. That is, let us address this animal called climate change. And we were quite excited as we were heading to Dubai to attend the COP28. And when I was looking at the 4 pillars which came from the conference, one of them being inclusivity. One of them was inclusivity, that is every voice is important. Another one was focusing also to focus on people, lives and livelihoods. That is, we need to improve lives and livelihoods of people, eradicate poverty, and also eliminate hunger. They also talked of other great things, actually, like fixing climate finance, which is a very big thing, actually. It is the animal in the room, and I think we are going to talk about it shortly. But there's something which they never talked about, which they never talked on. I remember here in Nairobi, we told the big nations, that is the US, China, India, the European Union, to reduce carbon emissions. That I don't think where that came out in COP28. And those guys are the greatest contributors of those greenhouse gas emissions. Talking of China, India, the US, the 3 countries contribute around 42% of emissions. When you add European Union, those are like, it's also around 61%. That's a great production of when we talk about greenhouse gas production. So I expected them to touch on yes, to own their sins, because we Africans, we are paying for sins we never committed.
We'll come back to talk about financing, but Wakili, now everyone here has said something, and it all comes back to laws and policies. When we started, you said we have laws in place. There are several acts and amendments that have been, the government, rather, the policymakers have established, but there's always the process of implementing and following through to these amendments. Now, where do we cut this tape, and how do we fix it, such that when we have laws, they are actually implemented?
Thank you. A number of things come up, but quite importantly, we need to appreciate that lawmaking at whatever level is a negotiation, a process of negotiation, a give and take. So you have interests to deal with. Now, at the international level, hearing Dr. Wambua talking about, for example, the GHG emissions were not addressed. And why were they not addressed? Power relations at that global level. And the greatest polluters are the greatest powers, and they determine conversations at the table, what gets admitted for discussion, and so on and so forth. But then also at the local level, I think also sometimes we get our priorities wrong rather. I'll tell you, for example, when you look at our Climate Change Act 2016, one of the things that I believe, first of all, it's a great thing that I think this country was, I think, the first in sub-Saharan Africa to have enacted that kind of legislation. But we got it right, but then we got it wrong in terms of the internal components of the law. And one thing that I think we got wrong was the issue of the Climate Change Council, where we roped in the president and the deputy president to be the lead. And for a long time, I don't even know whether by now the council has ever met, because of the nature of the schedule of the president and the deputy president. So we thought by roping in these 2 people, these 2 offices, we got it right. I think the idea was good, but the implementation strategy was very poor. Yeah, so when these interests are not taken care of, or when we do not really have very clear negotiation processes being put in place, and then our lawmaking, for example, in this country is top-down approach, so that there is, to a great extent, there is no the people on the ground do not really own decisions. So one, apart from them not owning the decisions, they are unaware. So that then means there needs to be a lot of civic education, which leads to public participation, effective and meaningful public participation, and not public participation in the manner in which it has been used as a rubber stamp for, decisions that predetermined decisions that just need to be rubber stamped.
And I come to you, Ruth, now. You're talking about issues to do with public participation. You are from the health sector. I mean, when the Nairobi Declaration was being formulated, there were meetings prior to health being included in that document. And as much as it is only a part of health that was included in that document, from the health perspective, why are you given a chance when during the SES to sit down and give your views on how best we can handle climate change from a health perspective and from that lens? Because when we talk about, if I want to treat malaria, I will go to a doctor to know what prescriptions to get. Did they consider you, or was it just another political process?
Well, as my colleagues here have said, we have come from far. When you look at who drives the conversation, it has been mainly the environment docket. And we have been at the periphery. Even for the longest time, if you ask, the Minister of Health was never involved when we are talking matters climate. So this has been siloed way of doing things. But I can say now that the recognition of health as a human face for climate change has actually led to the recognition of including other stakeholders, other sectors like health. And yes, now we are at the table. And when you ask about how well were we involved, yes, several meetings were held. And I can say we participated in some of these meetings where we had different stakeholders involved in coming up with our position that informed what also Kenya put, all the deliberations that were to go and inform the Africa position. Unfortunately, sometimes, given what you have said, political interests and the states, sometimes things get missed. And what you are saying, for advocates like us and the civil society, our work is trying to make sure that we keep the government in track and making sure that we don't lose focus on some of the major things. Because, when you look at why and what the most impacted sector is health when it comes to climate, and people actually. And from what Dr. have said, at least there's some progress. There's that pillar of human, there is livelihood, and there is also the lives. So at least in the human part of it, the lives part of it, we have health now being given a big focus. And we hope now, progressing to COP29, things we will have at least health as a main agenda, not being a periphery agenda as it has always been.
And COP29 will be in Azerbaijan. That decision was made. And I come to you, Shadrach. On a daily basis, you deal with members of parliament, representatives of the people. They have the mandate to speak and address our issues. Now, you are also a climate researcher. When you sit with these legislators in the National Assembly and advise them on how to address issues, COP, there's always push and pull. The president wants this, the opposition wants this. But how do we make sure that climate change is not a negotiating thing that someone wants to pull on their side, but it is a subject of national interest that is implemented to benefit the entire country, if not the region and the world?
Thanks, Dennis. When you say that there was a sugar symposium in Kisumu last week, and I used the analogy of an elephant. And when I asked the people who are attending the symposium of what they think of the elephant in relation to climate change, people give different views. And that takes you to a poem that was written, I think, some years ago by John Godfrey Sachs. The poem is about 6 visually impaired men who were told to go and touch the structure of an elephant that was placed somewhere. So each of them, remember these people are visually impaired, each of them touched different parts of the elephant. One of them touched the legs, and because the legs of an elephant are big, he said surely the elephant will be a tree. The one who touched the tusk said, the elephant must be a rope. The one who touched the horns said, surely the elephant is going to be or is a spear. You know, this is the challenge we have. Every one of us is seeing climate change from a different perspective. And remember, we have about or above 700 acts of parliament. And the challenge that we have had, and this is what I'm saying as a communication person, and this is what I tell people, the challenge we have had is to have different people from different departments seeing climate change as an issue that impacts them. During the Diabetes Day, I was asked to speak to students of Faisal University. And, you know, this is a diabetes, and then I was asked to speak on climate. You know, when I was trying to explain to them how climate change is linked to health, this is what I told them. Look at the floods. The floods destroy the roads, destroy the health facilities, and all this impact the management of diabetes. And this is the same thing that it needs to happen in Kenya. I mean, that's why we are having a conversation, but the conversation has not reached that level where everybody is saying there are different aspects as impacting climate change. So it's a work in progress. I know there are members of parliament have a lot of things, a lot of issues to solve, but you know, we need to help each of us, every one of us, to see different perspectives from different angles, such that even when they are making the policies, like now, you know, the president today, yesterday, signed to the National Government Constituency Development Fund. Do you see an aspect of climate change in that? Yes, it is there. So, do the people on the ground see an aspect of climate change and how that impacts them? I want to ask you just a minute. If the people from my constituency saw an aspect of climate change in what the fund has been meant to do now, they'll get involved in. But until we get everyone to see how they're impacted by climate change, there will be little participation. There will be little minimal participation.
Let me come to
I think
you.
We need to.
We need to synergize on
Yes.
that. Now, let me come to you, Daktari. Now, Daktari, every time we have this conversation on climate change, you always allude to the fact that we need to put a human face on climate change. The West will come to Africa and say, we are paying you guys for carbon credits. And I will come to you, Wakil, we talk about policies around carbon credits. But the international community will say, I will pay you this much to help us clean the atmosphere that we are dirtifying, in simple language. Therefore, as you talk about issues to do with emission, is it about time that as climate change experts, as climate change champions and governments, we need to finally come up with a policy that will determine this big thing in the room called carbon credits? It is on our own terms, not terms that are out there.
Thank you again, Dennis. You see, climate change is the single greatest threat to all life on Earth. And I think the level of sensitization is pretty low. It's only in urban cities. When you go to rural zones, it's like they do not know that much about this animal called climate change. So we need to take it seriously, and it needs to be a part of our curriculum. I know our competence-based curriculum talks about citizenship, which enforces students to think, to be civil and address challenges facing the society. But again, one thing which we must acknowledge and we must appreciate our National Assembly is that they have already approved a policy, a bill, that is the National Budget and Appropriation Committee, has already approved the bill to be sent to the Parliament for first reading, second reading, and third reading. And once it passes through all those stages, the President will put a signature, and it becomes a law. And you see, now that one will pave way for the formation of the Carbon Trading and Benefits Authority, which is not there. And this authority will give specifics on policies and procedures to dictate on how carbon credit business should be conducted. As we speak now, my good friend Professor Odhiambo will agree with me. There is a legal lacuna. There is that gap. I'm talking from an education point of view. There is that gap that there is no any law which regulates carbon credit as we speak now. I hope that authority is put in place the soonest possible, as soon as possible, because it's only after that it will define the policies which are to be put in place, and it will regulate the national activities when you talk about carbon credit as well as county level. But as of today, that policy is yet to be done.
But he says there's something called legal lacuna. Hey, big words. But anyway, let's talk about this legal lacuna and absence of policies that actually guide matters to do with climate change. There is also carbon credits that is big business. I remember having a conversation with someone, I was together with Ruth, and someone was saying climate change is actually a big business out there. And from an international perspective, it is a business that I will pay you some pocket change, but allow me to continue emitting. From a perspective of Kenya and carbon credits and the laws around climate change, what do we need to do? What must we do to make sure that we're not getting the short end of the stick?
Thank you. The reality is, for the foreseeable future, we may not even be holding the short end of the stick. We may not be holding any stick at all. Why do I say this? Now, we say it's big business, and that is true. It is big business, but he who pays the piper calls the tune. Now, who pays the piper? The big polluters. They pay the piper. And they determine how much they give us. But even before we even get into the conversation around how much they give us, there is also the question of, does carbon trade or carbon credits even work in the first place? Because how do you determine that indeed the trees I plant here in Kenya are able to absorb the so much pollution in China, for example? Is there really a correlation? So when you give me some money and you ask me to plant, set up a budget, plant trees, which ultimately may not even be planted the requisite number, so that the implementation of the carbon credits and the carbon trading is itself very problematic. In fact, if you look at, for example, the trend in Europe is actually moving away from the carbon credit system. And you saw the US under Donald Trump and the way they were claiming, which is true, that China, being a very big polluter, should not be left to be considered like, a country that is, a growing country, a growing economy, so that it does not have obligations, because the whole idea about carbon credits and carbon trading is about what is called common but differentiated responsibilities, that those of us who have the greatest responsibility in polluting the environment need to have a higher responsibility in cleaning up that environment, so that we do not have a situation where countries, especially in the global south, that are not so responsible for the pollution, end up bearing the greatest burden, so that there is a disparity between the responsibility as well as the burden. And that is why even the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol is problematic, because the big powers that are responsible for these high levels of pollution are dragging their feet in terms of taking up their fair share of responsibility. So for as long as they determine this business, they're the people who sit at the table in this where this dish is served, I think we may not be holding even the stick at all.
Ruth, now here's a question of, we keep talking about carbon credits. Dr. says we might even not be having that stick at all. We have no seat at the table because it is the big businesses that decide how this goes. Now, let's talk about financing of climate change matters, and even locally in our budget. From the health perspective, how much of that has been pumped into the health sector, specifically on climate-related problems in our own budget, before we even start asking for a share of the 100 billion from COP27?
Interesting. So, thank you. I just wanted to pick from where he left, and thank you, Prof, for that. My analogy of this whole carbon credit or whatever business is that somebody tells you, I'll pay you, but I will leave the tap open, and then you keep on mopping the floor. Will it change anything? It will not change. So what we are doing with the carbon credit business is that we have left the big boys, the polluters, to do their thing. So, and then they're saying, keep on mopping the floor for us. Is that what you want? And coming from the health perspective, we can get the money, but will it take, how will it impact on the already deteriorating situation that we are in? Because they continue emitting. We have health impacts, but however much you can be paid for it, it will not change things. So as we think about laws, as we think about which side of stick and how big we are holding, I think we should also be cognizant of the fact that our goal and what we should be pushing for is cutting on emissions. That way then we can start discussing on, yes, there is what you have already done, and you can pay for what you're doing, but then you have to stop. So how much of the money is coming to health?
Specifically for climate change?
That's a difficult one. But I don't have the figures. As I said, when you asked me about how well involved has health been in the climate discussions and now climate financing, is that it is only now that the discussion has come. So even the money for climate, actually, it has not really trickled down to the health sector as per se. So we cannot say that there's some budgetary allocation. There's no monies that we are saying this one is purely for health. Maybe in the next budget we will have, but right now I may not be very sure, but I don't think that we have that right now.
And we keep hoping, right?
We will keep on advocating for the same.
For that. Now, Shadrach, let me just talk to you in terms of, she's saying that her department allocation is almost zero. We just have allocation for the health sector, but nothing specific on climate change. Now, as we move forward, let's now look at solutions that we can do. As you continue advising members of parliament on issues to do with climate change, how do we make sure that they come together, see these as a collective responsibility, that even as we push for financing to come from outside, that even when the president says we need to really adjust the financing model, that locally we are playing our part, that as members of parliament with the responsibility to represent 52 or 55 million Kenyans, they play their part. Moving forward, what next for members of parliament on matters climate change specifically?
I think I need to respond to what Dr. Wambua and Felix mentioned. And by the way, we need to appreciate that Kenya is doing at least some work. We need to remember that the Climate Change Amendment Bill, the 2023 one, was to introduce the carbon market and credit mechanisms. So it is there. And I was involved in the process because I have an interest in that, so I was involved in it. And in the right now, I think the regulations, the process of making the regulations. I was part of the people who are reviewing the regulations. Of course, they might not be up to standard, but the fact that they are there, we need to appreciate that. So, you've asked me on going forward what needs to be done. I'll go back to the system thinking approach. Let me give you an example. There's a footbridge that has been built just along Mombasa Road. And that footbridge has gutters on top of it. During the rains, that water just went down the drain. So going forward, how do we, frame our policies and design our policies such that they speak to different aspects of development? For instance, health. If that water was tapped, the building of that bridge is a responsibility of transport and infrastructure. If a provision was made that water tanks should be installed under the bridge to conserve the water that is flowing down, that water, water is essential in the health sector. That water is piped to the next, there are so many hospitals around that area. If that water is pumped to the health facilities around that area, it addresses an aspect of climate, because we know climate change is causing, especially in Africa, we have three aspects. We have drought, we have floods, and then we have what? The heat waves. And these affect the health sector, okay? So, an instance that we can point to how the budget could be related to climate change, install these water tanks. This water that is collected is taken to the next facility, which is the health facility. It can be a school. So that way, if we look at it that way, then we can see how much money could be
allocated.
Yeah.
Let me come to you, Dr. finally, because time is not on our side. Briefly, moving forward, what is in it for Africa to make sure that this conversation is owned by Africans on matters climate change in Africa? How do we go about it and make sure that we are heard?
I think it is important for us to accept that we have limited resources and work with what we have. There are those low-hanging fruits like afforestation and reforestation projects to combat climate change. We have renewable energy installations, and we have energy efficiency programs which we can conduct to ensure that we reduce carbon emissions. And again, Ruth talked about transparency and accountability, which is very key. When funds are allocated to mitigate climate change, I think it's the high time for us to be accountable. It's for us to be collaborative enough. It's about us to do our part and use those funds well, so that we can have the results. Otherwise, we shall just be talking and talking and talking. We need to walk the talk. Time has come for us to walk the talk and address this animal called climate change.
Climate change. And yes, indeed. In studio with me is Ruth Ngeshu, Global Advocacy Director, Pathfinder International. I have Dr. Felix Odhiambo, Advocate of the High Court, Shadrach Agaki, Climate Change and Food Systems Communication Consultant, and Dr. Andrew Mbua from Africa Voices Dialogue, who say that we all need to play our part when it comes to matters climate change. We need to collaborate. That even when we are putting up laws, we need to follow it up on issues to do on implementation and follow through to that. That on matters health, we need to invest intentionally on health and climate change. And the communications, members of parliament need to stop pulling from both sides and look at climate change as an issue that affects each and everybody, including their constituents. And Dr. Wambua says that we need to humanize this conversation on climate change. And yes, after COP28, there is COP29 that is coming. Will we have the second Africa Climate Summit? Ladies and gentlemen, ponder on that. And what exactly will Africa come up with next time? And even at COP29, What are we going with? Will we finally get that financing restructured as President William Ruto demanded and asked the world to do? That we wait to see. My name is Dennis Aseto. This has been Planet Action, your #1 premier show on matters climate change. Enjoy the rest of your viewing. Eric Latif will be coming on Newsline with the primetime news. Good evening.